For the first time in a very long time, Cubase has got a new kind of editor. This is the pattern editor. For those of you who've been around other DAWs, you may find this familiar, but certainly it's a breath of fresh air. It's something quite interesting. It's one of the features I'm probably most excited about in Cubase 14 because it just allows you to get creative pretty quickly. You can get things done quicker, and you can see why pattern-based editors are so popular. Certainly, it's a bit of a throwback to older sequencing platforms I used many, many moons ago. So let's take a look at it. So here we are in Cubase, and as you can see, I've loaded up a drum machine preset. Main reason, because this is probably the way you're going to be using this most of the time. So when you go through this, if you create a new track, if you create a new drum track, you get the option to pick pattern event, or you can go for MIDI part, as you may want to do if you want to be old school. But if you create an instrument track, you'll notice while the default, again, is MIDI part, it can also be chosen with pattern event. And we will be looking at that later on because there's more to this than just drums, as we will see. But we're going to start out with the tour using drums because certainly for me, it makes most sense to do that at this point. So if you go to editor, you will see we get the pattern editor. Going to get rid of media base. We've got a bit more space on screen. And there's quite a lot to go through. So what we're going to do, we're just going to take a quick tour of just how you get started, because I think that's probably the most important thing. And then we're going to look at some of the features. There's quite a few. I'd say this is probably the feature I'm most excited about in the whole of Cubase 14, because to me, I've had the most fun playing with it. I've got to be honest. That's probably why. It's not perfect, but there's a lot to it. So we've got a pattern-based sequencer, which we haven't had in Cubase before. There's a number of things we can do, but first thing, just click and create a drum machine part. So the kind of thing you can do, obviously, with the drum editor, but let's just put in some bass drums. We're going to put in a bit of snare there, and then let's put in some hi-hats closed, and we'll scroll a bit further down and put in a hi-hat open there as well. In fact, I'm going to take that one out, and that's it. So if we press play, it just plays that. Yeah. So by default, it's just going to loop around that. You get that pattern there, and you can play around with this as much as you want. So let's just make a couple of changes to this. So the first thing you'll see is we've got some lanes down the bottom. So we're just going to stick with velocity for the moment. So let's just play around with those. Again, this should all be pretty intuitive stuff. If you've done any kind of editing, pretty much of anything MIDI-wise, this part of it isn't going to be a particularly new thing. It's like a change of the original drum editor, but there's more to it than that for sure. So we can just play around with these kind of things, velocity, etc. But these are where it gets interesting. So we're going to look at those a bit later on because we're just doing a quick tour of what you might want to play around with. Now, here we've got a number of steps and the resolution. So they are not linked necessarily. And we can even play around with the way things play. But let's just change the number of steps. So let's just say for our second kick, we're going to have fewer steps and make it 8. So you can see it tries to help you here by keeping the length the same. So if we go to 30 seconds, it will divide them up. If we go to halves, it will. But so if you want to change the resolution, you can change that there. You can change overall here as well if you want to do that. So we won't do that right now, but you can see we can just play around with these. Now, what's interesting about this here is the way we can fill these. So you may want to just try and randomize it. So let's just randomize that and see what we get. And if you don't like that, hit the dice again. Now, the one thing with this is at this point, there is no undo. I've just done undo, and you can see I got rid of the entire track. The whole lot went. I'm told that later on, undo will be preserved, etc., and will be implemented. So that will actually be part of that history. But at the moment, that's not the case. So when we bring this back, fortunately, undoing my delete, or rather undoing my undo, brought this back as it was. So it's sort of preserved, but it's not got the history in the way you'd want. So you can't undo these kind of edits, which is a bit of a limitation, but say I'm told that in a later revision, that will not be the case. So this is quite fun, having the ability to do these randomly, but there is much more. So over here on the left, we can generate steps in a different way. So we've got this Euclidean way of generating them, or we've got a random way. But let's say we just want to generate them in Euclidean seconds or thirds. So this would be every third one. This will be every fourth, etc. If you do a lot of fairly straightforward procedural drum type stuff, this is going to be a real joy of how you can do this. So let's just stick with this kick track for the time being. Let's go to 30 seconds, because then we'll see that resolution much more. So you can see seconds, thirds, fourths, etc. But we've got this pulses here, so we can choose how we fill this up. So you can see with none, it starts out slowly filling this up, which I quite like the fact that there will be 32 pulses and it's going to fill that. You can go back to this here. We've also got rotation. So you can see that rotates that. So if we put it into 2 pulses there, and then we can rotate round. So if you get used to using these, if this is the kind of thing you want to do, particularly if you're doing maybe something a little more experimental, or kind of there's an Aphex Twin track from years ago where it's like 63 over 64, etc., that kind of thing. So if you're doing something where you're playing around with patterns, polyrhythmic kind of stuff, anything like that, this is going to be a godsend, because you can experiment really quickly with this and find out whether it works for you. So if we just clear this particular lane, so you can see we can right click and we can do remove all steps from step lane. So we're just going to remove that, clear that out. Let's do it with a hi-hat, because that's probably going to be a lot more listenable. So let's just put it on 6 pulses. And we can rotate that around. If it weren't for the last pulse, I would quite like that. So maybe. So often I find with tools like this, you can play around with them and get nearly what you want, and then you can manually edit it. So this is probably not going to be the end game for everything, but it's quite fun. Now, if we go on randomization, we can choose the density here. So we had the default randomization here, but we can maybe make it less dense. We can hit that, and you can see we're not only getting randomization in terms of where the notes are, but also their velocity. So this would probably be more suited to 16ths. So let's give that another. Again, quite liking that. And then we've got swing and offset. So if we swing these, so that's quite nice. And you've got offset as well. So sometimes you'll find you've got a sound where maybe you want to do an individual offset to get it in time, or some of the stuff I've heard recently out of time. Again, as ever, Command or Control click will reset you to the default. But I quite like the swing in that, actually. So we're going to stick with that. Now, you may have also noticed you can play a track backwards. So you can play around with it. So you can see this one is now going right to left, or you can have it alternating. So you can kind of get money for nothing there, because it will go forwards like it is now, and then it'll go backwards. So overall, I find this pretty interesting for creative stuff. For a variety of reasons at the moment, I'm not feeling massively creative, but I've had a lot of fun with this. It's been really interesting just playing around with these things, playing around with the controls here, coming up with random stuff and then tweaking it a bit, which for me is the best way to work with this kind of thing. Bit like when people say, with AI, let's say, any generative kind of thing, it's probably not the finished result, but it can give you something inspirational that then you can finish off and take it in the real direction you want to go. So that's the basics of this window. Now we're going to have a look at what you can do with these lanes at the bottom, because there's quite a lot of interesting stuff in here as well. So here we have another track with a fairly mundane drum pattern in. Intentionally so, of course. So here's where we're going to look at some of the interest here. So we've already seen velocity. It's pretty easy to adjust, but we've got some really interesting things here. So repeats. So let's go on the snare track. We can just click on repeats and let's make this repeat more than once. So here we can see, we get an indication there that something's happening with it. So those kind of almost sampling. You can play around with that, get those repeats in there, etc. We'll see a way of doing this in a slightly more interesting way in a minute, but we'll just go through the basics. So we've got offset. So we can see that's a bit late. So again, sometimes you want to push things forward a bit. Sometimes you've got a sound that needs that, otherwise it's not going to be in time. So you've got these here that you can program in. Again, Command or Control double click will return it back to 0. Probability. This for me is where it gets interesting. So let's say I don't always want this little 16th skip at the end. I don't always have to have it. I can have it half the time. So when we play it back, see, there we go. We're slightly more than 50%. I appreciate that at the moment, but I think if we played it for long enough, we would get that 50% in there. And we've got velocity variance. So this, again, I've whittled on for literally decades, about programming drums where you have variance in the velocity to make it sound more interesting, potentially more human. But even if it's not trying to sound human, it will sound interesting. So we can do that with these hi-hats here. So they're just going to vary rather than being the same thing all the time. So this is combined with the velocities that you've got in there. So if you listen carefully, you hear these are varying. So it's not a huge thing, but it's something that's going to bring in a bit of interest in there. And finally, gate, which is best illustrated with probably another sound. So we're going to click on the snare, but there's also something else you need to do. So if you want to use gate, you've got to activate it in the drum machine. If you're not sure about the drum machine, there's another video on the channel which is covering it. But you can see here we're on the snare. We need to turn gate mode on, okay? Once that's on, we should now see. You can hear that sounds different. So you can hear this one's much shorter. Now, obviously, you'd probably need to go back to the drum machine and tweak this as well to get exactly what you want. But you can hear, again, you can program this in and get it a bit more interesting. So again, a bit more. So maybe that skippy one would be, it's not going to turn up. It's not going to play now, is it? Yeah, there we go. So that kind of thing just gives you a nice amount of control. You can actually add other parameters to this as well. So you can click in here. We've got automation. So if you've set up any automation, you can do that. We've got AI parameter 1, but we've also got MIDI controllers. So we can send out MIDI controller data here, which again can be interpreted by drum machine. It can be interpreted by whatever synth you're sending it to. So it's nice to have this control here. Say that's all 127. Controllers plus pitch bend and aftertouch and so on. So that's quite nice to see enough control there to be able to send all sorts of things in these patterns. So that's an overview of this area. Let's take a look at something you can do, which I think is interesting, even if maybe no one else does. So here's something which I discovered playing around with this. It's a way to make this more usable. Now, if you have an example where, let's say we've got this snare here, and on this one in particular here, we want this to be repeated. So let's say we wanted it to be repeated 4 times. The problem I've got, I don't always want it to do this. I want it to do it some of the time. So you think, right, I'm going to set my probability of that to maybe, less than half. So it occasionally does it. But when it doesn't do it, you end up with nothing. And that's a problem. But I found a way around this. I'm not sure whether you're supposed to be able to do this, but it does work. So let's put this back to how it was, because this is not going to be the one that does the repeat. So we've got our standard one in here. And what you can do is add a new lane. So if you ever need to build one of these, as we'll be seeing a bit later on, you can just add lanes as you want. So we can add a step lane. It gets down the bottom. At the moment, I don't think you can move these. I have put in a feature request to be able to reorder them, but you can't at the moment, which is a bit annoying. What you need to do is to set it to the same pitch. So we see we're on D1 here. So we're going to change this to D1. It's a slightly odd way of choosing these, but you can type it in. So we'll go drum machine, snare D1. If you just put it on this D1, it would work the same. If you put it on this, it would work as well. But let's put it on there because that makes it clearer. Now, what we're going to do is, I think the way this works is the lower down the list, it takes priority. So we're going to put in on step 13 that repeated one with a probability of, let's say, 50%-ish. So it comes up reasonably quickly. And when we play it, we get that, but when we don't, we get the single one. So we get, occasionally, we get that, but it doesn't miss out. I quite like this because it means it's still a musical pattern. You could obviously be much more complicated with this. You could have, maybe a 3 that would come up on the same lane. So let's say we could go, again, there's another snare. So let's just pick snare D1. Again, same thing with a really low probability or a lower probability again, but let's make it repeat even more. So there's that one, and then hopefully, nothing. So you can see it switches around. You can get these evolving patterns really nice and interesting, I think. So this is certainly, for me, this is something that makes it much more musical because you can program these in and then have variations that just happen throughout the whole part. Yeah, that's my tip of the week for this particular piece of Cubase 14. Now let's have a look at some other elements of this. So along the top, we've got some pretty standard stuff. So firstly, keeping the editor content. So this is useful. There's a number of places where this appears in Cubase, but this is quite handy because even if you go to another track, we're going to stay on this. Whereas normally, if we click that, we would then switch to this other track. So that's quite handy. We've got our step lane inspector. So this is this area here. So if you're tight on space, you can turn that off. You don't always need it. A lot of the time, you're just going to be working in these two zones, but that's quite handy. Play with project is useful because otherwise, if you turn that off, if I hit play, this bottom one's playing, excuse me, but this one is not playing. Yeah, so play with project is useful while you are auditioning them. So you can see now when I play that back, it's coming back on and we're getting all those parts of this particular bit we programmed up earlier on playing. We've got our number of steps and step resolution. So if you want to change all of these quickly, we see everything changes to 30 seconds, but notice that your pattern gets compressed if you do that. If we go back to 16, we do that, whereas if you do it here, obviously it only affects your one track. I'm hoping they will implement a mode which allows you to subdivide these so you can change this to say 30 seconds, but they would stay where they are beat-wise. I'm told that might happen, but it's certainly not happening at the moment. Pattern play direction, again, we've got overall control for this. You can nudge the patterns just like you can nudge them here. And then you've got the actual patterns. Now here, you can drag this to a project. So initially, you'll probably just be doing this in play with project loop mode, but then after a while, you're probably going to want to change these. So what we can do is we can just drag this onto here, and then that appears as the pattern, and you get a representation of it here as well. So we got an idea of what's going on. Here, we can make a new one. So we can duplicate that pattern, and then I'm just going to change some of the hi-hat. In fact, let's just randomize that bit. There we go. So that's a new one. So that's number 2. And if we drag number 2 here, we can see that's there. You can also choose them here. We'll look at the conversion to MIDI parts a bit later on, but you can quickly change between the two. So you can imagine you can build up your arrangement pretty quickly. These work in much the same way as you would expect. So you can drag them around. You know, it's Cubase after all. So we've got all that kind of thing where we can do whatever we want. We can repeat them, everything you would expect. And if you change this one, you can see that's changing individually, etc. So the kind of thing you would imagine in terms of building that. You can make new or duplicate patterns, which is just this here. We can control the amount of randomization, including the number of steps that are present in this particular pattern. So there we go. If you're a random person, you can just do that. And that changes all of these. So this is one thing to be aware of. If you change this pattern here, all of these change, as you can see above. So beware of that, because I think there's the possibility to have some unintended changes, because this is a bit like having ghost copies of MIDI parts, where when you alter the original, all of its ghosts or children change as well. So that might be what you want. Often it will be, but sometimes it won't. And with the lack of undo that's available here, because if we undo this, you can see we undo the structural changes I've made, but these are not undone. So there is the room to be at home to Mr. Cockup at some point during this. So I would be careful when you're doing stuff like just randomizing it. Although, you know, maybe I'm a bit more risk averse than some of you watching this. So you can play around with that. Randomization mode. So we've got musical, hybrid, or full. Right. So let's roll the dice, shall we? Hybrid randomization or full randomization. Yeah. I would say probably musical seems to be the one to stick with, because we can see it's accenting or favouring things, which will probably make more sense. But again, depends what you're after. And then overall swing. So here we saw swing individually earlier on, where you can swing that, but we can also have overall swing. So if we go back to pattern 1, because that will probably make more sense. Yeah, we can hear that on the hi-hats, etc. And we can anti-swing it, which has always been a strange concept to me. And let's just take the swing out of that. Yeah, we can hear that actually working now, because it seems that the track swing overrides that. So here we've got the colours that are applied. So they can be the pattern editor, they can be the pitch, which will make a bit more sense as we look at something a bit later on. Or we've got drum machine colours. So you can see we've got the colours of the pads are represented here. Or we've got the pattern editor colours. Now the pattern editor colours are not configurable, which apparently may be coming later on. But at the moment they're not. So you just get what you get. And finally, you can have this in a pop-out mode. So if you want to, particularly if you've got a big screen, or you want to see all these patterns at the same time, you can do that. Probably should have done that for the whole video, really, shouldn't I? Never mind, we will do it a bit later on. But you get the idea with this. This is pretty flexible. Generally intended for drums. But now let's look at a different use case, which I think is interesting. So it's not just for drums. It's definitely a pattern editor. Okay, so this is definitely to be filed under my experimental things I've found that might be of use to you, rather than this is the killer application. So the pattern editor is just generating MIDI data. So what I've done here is I've created a Hallian Sonic, which has just got the S90 ES piano. So it's just got a piano on there. But when I created the track, much like this, I chose pattern event rather than what you'd normally have MIDI part. This means we've got the pattern editor here. Then I've assigned these MIDI notes, effectively these pitches, to just parts of a C major 7 arpeggio. So we've got C, E, G, and B. Rather annoyingly, you can't select them via MIDI by any way that I've found, which is something which I would like to be able to do, because I think that would be a nice, quick way to do this. And if you could do that, this would be much more instant. It would be really, really useful. Now, Again, this is just sort of experimental. It might drive you in a particular direction, or it might drive you to go and watch a Mr. Beast video or something. But here we go. So I've just drawn in some notes just on this particular thing. And remember, we've got all of the options here, so you can have repeats, probability, and this, that, and the other. So this is where I think this might become interesting. So if I just play this back, I'll just leaving the drums going so you can get the idea of what's going on. And that's kind of piecemeal, but if you change the number of steps that are available, you can get something interesting. So we get an interesting repeat because it's 14 long and it's repeating those last two before it loops round. And then, so I've just spent a bit of time playing around with this kind of thing. It's come up with some more interesting ideas, but I think I maybe think about things in a particular way. And I like arpeggiated figures where they are a bit kind of polyrhythmic or offsetting each time, etc. So as long as you come up with a number which is different to the number of notes that's in here, it's a quick route to doing that kind of experimentation and improvisation with those kind of things. But as I say, obviously, we've got the ability to randomize this as well. And that's where I think this becomes quite nice. So I'm going to remove these two lanes because I only want to have just the elements of that chord. So I can just remove that step lane. I can remove that step lane. Obviously, you could add in as many as you want. You could make it really complicated, have it across different octaves, this, that, and the other. This is just an idea. But if we put in some randomness there, we might get some that translated into a bass line, instant song starter as far as I'm concerned. So here, because we're in 11, it's coming up with something that's a bit more interesting. Let's go for hybrid. And that, again, I mean, if I move that, I'd be interested in that. Heading off to Steve Reich territory. And let's try full randomization, because that seemed a bit full on earlier on. So while I've been experimenting with this, I found if I put in an odd number here and I put in the pitches that I want and then just experiment with the randomization, it comes up with ideas which I think, yeah, I could use that quite a lot. So this probably isn't a finished thing. Again, with a lot of these randomization things, as I said earlier on, it just gives you some fragments you can grab onto and go, yeah, I like that idea. Say, particularly if you're feeling uninspired. I've always found randomness originally via the logical editor was quite useful for just generating ideas that then you could go with. Much like, you know, you might be rehearsing with a band and somebody will just be noodling around. They'll come up with an idea. You go, yeah, that's great. I'm going to use that. Yeah, so these are just sort of song startery kind of ideas. I like the use of this. I wish this had the way to get these MIDI notes in more readily, because then you could just get in your chord, etc. But that's by the by. So once you've got this kind of thing, what you sometimes need to do is to turn them into MIDI events. Now, you can do this, but you've got to be a bit careful, because once you've done it, it's irreversible, as it were. So if we took this and converted it to a MIDI event, it would be gone, other than if we do undo. So what I've tended to do, in an earlier version, we could just drag these to other tracks, which was actually much nicer, but that seems to have disappeared. If we make a copy of this and convert this event to a MIDI part, then we get a MIDI one we can edit. And what's interesting is you can have MIDI events and pattern events on the same track, and they both work. So this here, if I turn cycle off and just solo just this. So then if you want to do further editing, start playing around with this, and you can't do it with the pattern editor, you can do that. Then, of course, you can drag this to another track and play around. That isn't something you can do readily with this. So you see, if I try and drag this to another track, it doesn't create a new track, whereas with that, it does. That may change by at some point in the future, but at the moment, that's not the case, which is a little bit disappointing, I have to say, because I I would like to be able to drag these around. And in an earlier version, you could just drag them all over the place, which was actually quite fun. If you get a MIDI part from one, you can drag it onto another. So you can always do MIDI stuff on a pattern track, but you can't do pattern stuff on a MIDI track. And you don't seem to be able to copy patterns from one to another, which hopefully will be resolved, maybe even by the time you see this. But at the moment, that's not. Let's say, I would encourage you to just connect up an instrument, say probably one with a more interesting sound than a piano, unless you're trying to emulate Steve Reich, and then just allocate some notes, play around, maybe draw some stuff in. And remember, obviously, you've got all of these controls here, so repeats and probability and this, that, and the other. So you've got all sorts of things that can happen and be really interesting with this, which I think actually is as big a strength as being able to use it for drum programming. And clearly for drum programming, it's going to be pretty accessible, quick and easy to create interesting and variable drum parts. It's at this point in the video I have to apologize to those people who've been screaming at the screen for the duration. Yes, everybody knows somebody who's seen everything before, but if you've ever used GarageBand on the iPad, which is free, then you will have seen this before. Here on screen, you can see GarageBand on the iPad, and if I open up the drum track, which I've got here, you'll see the editor looks very familiar. So we've got on-off for turning things on and off. We've got velocity controls. Yeah, so far, so what? But we've also got repeat, and you can see I'm changing the repeat of this to be 1, 2, or 3, etc. And we've also got chance, which is probability. So I can make this more or less of a chance to have this hand clap sound. And if I play this, you get the idea. Yeah, so this ultimately is a feature which has been in GarageBand for some time, and we're finally getting in Cubase. I think there's maybe a bit of snootiness, or possibly there may be a bit of snootiness from some people saying, well, why have we got a feature from this? But personally, I think it's a nice, creative, quick, easy thing. It's certainly something which is good for starting out and also making tedious programming jobs easier. And it means you're more likely to do a lot of variations and playing around. But it's certainly interesting to see that it's pretty much looks like a straight lift from GarageBand and probably other DAWs as well. But I was quite surprised when I first started playing around with GarageBand for reasons, and found this pretty quickly and thought, that looks familiar. So there you have it. Cubase now has a pattern editor which is very similar to something from a free iPad app. But does that matter? Well, I'm not sure that it does, because ultimately it's a useful tool. Well, I think it is anyway. I think it's quick and easy to use. It's pretty immediate. It's the kind of thing you almost wouldn't need to know how to use it straight away. But then some of the subtleties and some of the things with randomness, etc., make it much more interesting. The fact you can change cycles, it makes it possible to create some interesting generative music with the randomness and variation that's available in there. Is it perfect? No. I think there's a few iterations to go before it will reach something like that. There's a few features which hopefully are coming to do with changing cycles and changing the note divisions while not losing the notes that you have, because at the moment it's a bit clunky, and if you decide you want to change from 16ths to 30 seconds, you effectively have to reprogram whatever you've done rather than it stay in the right time position, and you just subdivide those notes. But sort of nitpicking-y around this area, the main thrust of it is the fact we've got a new interesting editor which has given you some new possibilities in terms of just programming, but also variation and interest, and making randomness and probability become much more available. You no longer have to dive into the logical editor to do a lot of these things, and you can get something happening pretty quickly, which is much more interesting than it used to be. Anyway, hope you found this video useful, and we'll see you again soon-ish for more Music Tech Tuition.